The first time I played Dark Souls 1, I was very much a casual, and what else could I have been? We were all casuals back then. My roommate at the time recommended it to me and let me borrow his copy, which left me with no financial obligation to finish the game and get my money's worth. I hadn't seen much, if any, Dark Souls content, so I had very few preconceived ideas about the quality of the game. I was in the perfect position to be blown away by an unexpected gem which I hadn't considered playing before. And you know what? I absolutely hated it. After beating two bosses with terrible hitboxes and plunge attack gimmicks, traversing through an eyesore of a world full of annoying springy hollow pricks, and ultimately taking the shortcut to New Londo at my roommate's recommendation to receive the S-Stock, which he described as one of the best dex weapons, I found myself wondering, if I already have the best weapon, what can I do with it other than fight enemies I wasn't enjoying fighting, in order to progress through areas I wasn't enjoying exploring through, just to fight bosses I wasn't enjoying fighting. Just to get worse loot than I already have. And while in hindsight I didn't fully grasp at the time how the loot systems of Souls games would really work, I still think it was understandable that I stopped playing at that point. There were plenty of other games at the time offering much more enjoyable gameplay than what I had seen in Dark Souls, and the experience had left me bitter towards the Souls series for many years to come. My journey through the Souls games would have stopped there if it wasn't for a very good friend of mine. When I was going through some of my most desolate moments of pure unbridled sadness and depression, he was always there to say, "Shut the fuck up, pussy, get on Xbox." While this might not seem like the most comforting to some, the combination of ignoring my mental state while always being down to chill was exactly what I needed to grow as a person. Some people need therapy, and some people just need to thug that shit out. And I would have never learned that lesson without my dear friend, Booty Juice. Me and Booty became very close, playing just about every single game together, with a large exception being the Souls games. It wasn't until Booty told me he was doing a fresh playthrough in DS3 and that his character was named Jester before sending me a screenshot of the ugliest created character I've ever seen that I finally let go of my stubborn ideas about the series and purchased DS3. I fat rolled through half of the game, wore the heaviest armor I could find, blocked every attack with a great shield, pumped the health stat and was virtually useless, while Booty did everything, and it was fucking rad. With each subsequent playthrough, I refined my gameplay more and more while getting equally more enjoyment out of the game as I learned to play it more efficiently. By the time I was ready to move on and give DS1 another chance, I had become much less of a casual, and I set out with the mindset to beat Dark Souls, not just to play it. I saw it as a challenge that I wouldn't give up on until I felt as though I had crushed the game with ease. And even though there was many desks punched and at least a controller or two broken along the way, I feel comfortable in saying that I love DS1. I enjoyed it thoroughly. And so, video over, right? A relatable story of someone learning to like a challenging game after seeing through its faults. A more simple version of myself was at one time comfortable with that answer. However, after years of playing better and better Souls games, spending ridiculous amounts of time learning various bosses and attempting to fully analyze and understand the philosophy behind these games and to figure out what makes them great, I've come to a singular conclusion about Dark Souls 1. It's a piece of shit. Yeah, I kinda just went full circle on that one. I think I was right the first time. That insulting statement, however, begs the question, why did I have such a renaissance with the series and with Dark Souls 1 itself? Why does everyone hold this game in such high regard if it is just a so-called piece of shit? And why do I claim that DS1 fooled you into thinking you enjoyed it? Well, before I reveal that, I'm going to prove to you that this game is garbage. Why? Because I want you to watch more of my video. I mean intrigue, I'm building suspense or some shit. Let's get to the analysis. Let's start with the most nebulous aesthetic stuff. World building, character designs, and overall look of the game.
In the age of ancients, the world was unformed, shrouded by fog. A land of grey crags, arch trees, and everlasting dragons. But then there was fire. Then, from the dark, they came and found the souls of lords within the flame.
This is our introduction to this world, empty except for dragons. 4 little hollows find magic fire that turns them into very specifically themed lords, although we can assume this transformation took potentially thousands of years, but we don't know because they don't tell us. The lords kill the dragons and take their land before doing a bunch of medieval fantasy stuff for an undisclosed amount of time. Eventually, the Age of Fire begins to fade, and it's up to you as the chosen undead to kill everyone, take their power, and decide the fate of the world. Now this world building is just kind of weird, to say it nicely, but mostly it's just kind of pointless and ambiguous. In many ways it would have been better to say nothing at all. For example, we didn't need to be told about the dragons being exterminated. If the world could just relay this message effectively by having ancient dragon remains littered throughout the world and a few remaining living dragons in hiding, you wouldn't need the heavy-handed cutscene. Instead, we get a bunch of brightly colored drakes, undead dragons, and hydras all around the world, which seem to be the descendants of the exterminated dragons. And since the amount of dragon-class enemies rival any other faction above basic hollows in terms of numbers, it makes the grandiose cutscene battle just kind of feel like a misrepresentation of the truth. Yet it was our introduction to this whole game. To oppose the ancient overworld filled with nothing but dragons, we're shown an underground filled with nothing but hollows, finding the first flame. Once again, we're left with an ambiguous starting point in the world building that is made to represent every single humanoid character in the entire game. These two factions rise up against each other, the humans win, and then however much time passes until we enter the game. Everything that happens in between makes up the world of Dark Souls is left completely to the imagination. And yet, despite all that nebulous information left for the player to fill in, or vacha vidya, the world still manages to contradict itself, such as the inclusion of cats, dogs, giant birds, and every other single animal in the game. It would either have to also be descendants of dragons, which would further weaken the idea that they were exterminated, or they were natural to the world, living with ancient dragons of the past, or they were Gwyn's creation. And honestly, that sounds like the most probable, being that he's a god, but also the weirdest to me. Like, imagine you live in Lordran and the only life you've ever seen is humans and dragons. And then one day Gwyn walks out of his lab with a hairy four-legged mammal, and he's just like, look what I made. It's a giant fucking rat. Kind of normalizes the Witch of Izalith's demons, so under those circumstances, I'm not sure why Gwyn wanted to kill them all. See, I feel like a stupid asshole even speculating on this stuff because it's entirely ill-defined. It could be anything you want it to be. The real answer as to why the world is filled with so many contradictory creatures comes down to a simple fact. Miyazaki loves Magic the Gathering and has taken huge inspiration from the cards themselves in the making of his games. This leaves me with one large unanswered question. Miyazaki, why the fuck haven't you taken inspiration from the sliver creatures? They're like the coolest thing in all of Magic the Gathering, and the concept has so much potential in other mediums. For those of you who have sex, the slivers are a creature in Magic that act as a biologically linked hive mind, able to splice each other's DNA into one another to evolve on the fly. In-game, every single sliver card you summon's text will either say all slivers get whatever ability the creature is supposed to have, or all slivers under your control in the newer cards. Just imagine a legacy dungeon in Elden Ring, populated by sliver-like creatures. There could be a series of mini-bosses worth taking out in order to produce the main queen boss's moveset and abilities, or more advanced players could take on the queen directly at her strongest, which could serve to eliminate adds from the mini-boss fights. Not to mention that with Elden Ring spirit summons, there's potential to have weakened sliver summons that apply debuffs to the bosses for however long they survive the fight. Now you might be wondering why I decided to go on a random tangent about my favorite creature in a fantasy card game that I don't even really play anymore. This is to emphasize the fact that I am just as much of a loser nerd as Miyazaki is. I'm definitely not above enjoying a stereotypical fantasy world just for the sake of cheesy sword fight dragon fantasy nonsense. However, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that copying the framework of Magic's creatures and characters is enough to flesh out a world of its own in an entirely different property. No other Souls game displays this so blatantly. Just about every single DS1 enemy can be boiled down to the exact land mana cards you would use to summon them. The demons are red mana, Nito's faction is black mana, Seath is blue, Sif is green, Gwyn's Pantheon is white, and you could even say that the Iron Golem represents an artifact card. All of this builds to a very generic fantasy world that doesn't seem to make sense, especially considering how close together the various enemy factions have to be positioned to one another, being that the world is very small, but we will touch on that later. The world of Dark Souls 1 lacks cohesion in two major categories, the first being enemy placement and the second being the existence of certain enemies at all. When it comes to placement, you have enemies that exist in situations they really shouldn't be in, such as the giant Hydra living in a puddle in Darkroot, painting guardians defending the rafters in the painting chamber, a bunch of undead dragon legs in Lost Izalith, silver knights positioned on the ledge of the castle. Like, how do you even get to and from work if you're stationed here? Not to mention that this guy embodies that one fart and I'm dead meme. And the last I care to mention is the Titanite demon living within the tiny chapel room in Anor Londo. This is exceptionally incompetent when considering that he couldn't have even fit through the doorway, and Gwyn's Pantheon does not have a good relationship with the demons, except the Batwing demons, I guess. The fact that they're your only way to get into Anor Londo, yet they're positioned to defend the main chamber with their lives, muddles the water even further. On the other side, there's the enemies that shouldn't exist at all given the world building we know so far. I'm going to stick to the most poignant example I have here, but I think for most of you this is going to be a hard pill to swallow. The Mimic does not make any sense existing in Dark Souls. It doesn't fit within any faction of enemy, its design is pretty illogical, and even though I find them mechanically interesting and generally pretty cool, it doesn't change the fact that they are completely out of place. They simply represent a generic fantasy idea that was added to the game because it was cool, and not because it made sense to be there. And that's really my point with all this. If you really take the time and energy to analyze this game with any more investment than "it's cool so I like it," you'll realize that a large swath of the enemies in this whole game are nothing more than out-of-place fantasy nonsense, which was included because it was cool. There are major offenders like the Mimic, but there are also minor offenders like the Frog Ray, which just seem kinda strange to add into a game called Dark Souls. They're fucking adorable. Now, the Frog Rays could have worked well as a magic card. That might seem hard to believe given their overall lack of combat potential, however, they remind me of one of my favorite decks I made a long time ago, based around a card called the Sigiled Starfish. The Starfish had 0 attack and 3 defense, which for 2 mana made it a pretty decent blocker. Thinking it funny that a Starfish could successfully block any number of creatures with anything less than 3 attack, I built an entire deck around the ridiculous gimmick of enchanting and buffing an army of Starfish with various +1/1s, creature enchantments, and auras. It was admittedly a pretty bad deck, but it did win occasionally, and the satisfaction of beating the opposing planeswalker by commanding an unblockable 5/9 flying hexproof sigiled starfish wearing the Brawler's Plate giving it trample, and wielding a Gorgon's Head and a Fire Shrieker giving it death touch and double strike made it all worthwhile. While this is a ridiculous concept, it is at least somewhat justified within the framework of Magic. You play as a planeswalker, a being who travels the multiverse collecting spells, enchantments, artifacts, and My Little Ponies to use in battle. On paper, the Starfish shouldn't be a threat whatsoever, yet when 7 other cards representing powerful creatures and weapons lend the fish their powers and abilities, it becomes justified to assume that it could rival the strength of a god. The failure of Dark Souls is in taking inspiration from a various assortment of magic cards, those being creatures from entirely different planes of existence from one another, and then jamming them together within a small map with little thought taken to make their existence in this world cohesive. Within the time frame of minutes, slowly walking through this world, you can encounter an undead dragon, brightly colored drakes, a lost black knight, Havel imprisoned by a wooden door, the Puddle Hydra, Bushmen, a Titanite demon, an army of zombies buffed by a shredded wizard, and Frog Rays. And you can see all of this within seconds of reaching Firelink if you choose the Master Key or Thief class. Overall, this world feels like a jumbled mess of fantasy concepts with very little throughline. Its successor succeeds in this aspect where DS1 fails. Dark Souls 2... Dark Souls 3 manages to implement many fantasy-style creatures while maintaining a consistent aesthetic theme between them. While DS1 has some Hollow-type enemies which represent living in the world of fading fire, fucking Frog Rays seem like they're doing fine, whereas in DS3 just about everything feels as though it's living in a decaying world. Now this is the type of comparison I often like to make when analyzing FromSoft's work. I shit all over something that I believe deserves it. Why? To highlight just how much they've improved the quality of their work over the years. You could, simply for the sake of worshipping Miyazaki wholly without fault, make the claim that DS1 is perfect and every enemy placement, bit of world building, and lore was implemented thoughtfully with nuance, but personally I find this to be somewhat disrespectful to the hard work and growth that FromSoft has shown in their later work. DS1 was a messy, lazily put together game with many development constraints along the way, and it shows in their final product. DS3 is a beautiful dark world with consistent themes. It's not perfect, but it shows a large degree of growth and experience within the development team, largely owed to the lessons learned while developing Bloodborne. As I said in my review, Bloodborne is aesthetically incredible, but many Bloodborne stans refuse to hear that when frothing with rage over the fact that I called the game mid. I love the Bloodborne community. Never change. Now speaking of aesthetics, let's take a look at Dark Souls graphically. Dark Souls was released in 2005, and considering the other titles released within the same year, such as Resident Evil 4, it doesn't look much worse than its peers. It certainly has its moments looking like garbage, but overall what could you expect from a classic title released so many years ago? The only problem with this is that Dark Souls wasn't released in 2005. It was released in 2007, which doesn't seem like a huge leap in terms of time, but considering that this was the same year Halo 3 came out, it's safe to assume that the standards had been raised quite significantly in terms of graphics. Halo 3's low points make Dark Souls look like shit almost across the board, and while it's definitely not fair to compare DS1 to a AAA title like Halo 3, it doesn't really matter at the end of the day because DS1 wasn't released in 2007, it was released in 2011. Okay, I'm being serious this time. DS1 was released on September 22nd, 2011. Just a month and a half before the release of fucking Skyrim. And if you're having a hard time believing that these games came out within the same year based on the footage at hand, I'll have you know that I captured all my footage playing the remaster that came out in 2018, which obviously did not prioritize graphics. DS1 benefits from a sense that it's supposed to be an ugly world, therefore nothing has to look good. Personally, I cannot accept this, especially when Bloodborne clearly proves that FromSoft is capable of making ugly, as in horrifying, concepts with competent graphical designs. Bloodborne is a very ugly world filled with ugly denizens. Yet, it is one of the most aesthetically forward games ever made. This remaster is kind of insulting when it's really nothing more than a patched port to newer consoles while including the DLC. And that's fine by me, because DS3 really feels like a remake of DS1. It does everything that DS1 set out to do without the baggage of older design choices. Anyway, to conclude this section, there are many personal reasons to enjoy and appreciate the world of Dark Souls. I would have no problem voicing my opinion that I think DS1 is very cool in most of its design. However, this design is fundamentally paper-thin and vague. It's an ugly world that doesn't make much sense. I think even the biggest DS1 dick rider would have to agree with me on that, even if they can't help themselves but to inject a hollow, meaningless statement like, "It not making sense is what makes sense in Lordran," or "There is immense beauty in creating something purposefully ugly," to help themselves cope with the fact that their favorite game is ugly nonsense. Now moving on to bosses, which to me is the most important part of a Souls game. Rather than going chronologically like I would normally do, I've separated them into 3 categories. The important fights, the ones everyone knows are bad, and the DLC fights. The first 4 important fights are pre-warp fights, starting with the Gargoyles, which are pretty serviceable as a boss fight. The tail cut mechanic can be pretty interesting mechanically, offering you a chance not only to obtain a new weapon, but to reduce the boss's moveset while granting a moment of stagger. The Gargoyle is one of the only bosses to integrate this mechanic thoughtfully, giving you natural openings to allow you to damage the tail with the added risk of potential tail attacks. Far too many other tail cut fights end up resulting in awkward, sloppy gameplay as the boss desperately attempts to face you head on. The added second Gargoyle at half health makes this fight needlessly frantic, which is especially frustrating due to the pitfalls on either side of the roof. This fight will quickly teach you to almost never use the lock-on, as the archaic design readjusts your dodge sometimes in dramatic ways, throwing you in a direction wildly askew to the direction your thumbstick was pointing. The unintended consequences of the ganky last half of this fight is that you'll have an exponentially harder time with this fight the lower your damage is, rather than a linear increase. The longer you have to spend in this fight, the more AoE fire you'll have to dodge, sometimes leaving you with the roof's edge at your back and nowhere to run, especially so when targeted by both gargoyles at once. This isn't the most important issue in the world, but it certainly isn't entirely competent design. The balance of the game as a whole is shifted with this exponential difficulty scaling, considering the red Tearstone ring gives you a 50% increase in damage, resulting in no-hit runs that 5-shot the gargoyles before a second one can even reach you, whereas health build casuals will end up fighting both of these assholes for a considerable amount of time. All the while with the risk of getting one-shotted despite all of your health and armor by being knocked out of the arena. After beating the gargoyles and ringing the first bell, you'll have to beat Quelaag to ring the second. I think Quelaag is a pretty good fight, and I can't put my finger on why. But I'm sure I have my reasons. She's overall pretty well designed, except for the oversight that you can jam yourself into her spider's armpit to avoid all her melee attacks while attacking yourself. You'll occasionally take a hit, but overall the damage that you'll do will overshadow the damage you receive. Other than that, she's one of the high points in DS1 boss fights, being one of the very few that can actually fight as a boss, and not some static, mechanical, gimmicky encounter. Speaking of which, the Iron Golem forgot to tie his shoelaces. The only reason you would spend more than 30 seconds in this fight is if you failed to avoid his grab move. He's a gimmicky pushover, quite literally, and I don't know why someone bothered to build him only to position him on a tiny walkway with fatal drop on either side. Should have equipped him with the tetrapod legs. Last of the early game fights is Ornstein and Smo, which to me get huge points in terms of originality and experimental design. A boss that gives you agency over how the fight will play out is always a welcome sight, which becomes even more interesting when considering the loot drops are different depending on which boss you leave for Phase 2. There's many reasons to appreciate this fight, and it definitely tests your skills. However, it's unfortunate to say that the skill this boss highlights is that it literally tests your patience. It's really impossible to say there are any real openings, as every potential for dealing damage / risk of being hit is really just a judgment call. While that's more or less a staple of all gank fights, ONS really seems to exemplify this. It feels like a balancing act to keep Smo behind a pillar to avoid his charge move, while making sure Ornstein isn't casting a spell or animation canceling his dash thrust, only to hit you with the instant attack when overcoming whatever obstacle was blocking him. There's also moments when Smo's hammer pushes Ornstein closer to you and within range of the attack he would have otherwise missed. Also positioning issues when attempting to damage Smo, as his hammer can eat hits that would otherwise have damaged him. All of these factors have to be accounted for while finding openings to attack, which Ornstein can potentially iframe through with his backstep. ONS is definitely a fight that requires a specific skill set to be successful in. However, I honestly just find the fight to be more stressful than fun, even now when I've beaten him many times in the making this video and feel well practiced. With ONS defeated, you're now free to proceed up the lifts before obtaining the Lord Vessel. Whoa, mama!
Hello, handsome. What a day, You look lonely. I can fix that.
Let's start this from the top. Dark Souls is one of the greatest video games ever created. No.
We must stay focused, brothers.
So far the game has been pretty unremarkable in terms of bosses. Serviceable? Sure, but nothing to really write home about. They've ranged from medium highs to medium lows, but nothing too great and nothing too insulting. However, now that we've obtained the Lord Vessel, we've reached the end game. 4 Lord Souls to gather before our final showdown with Gwyn. This is really the point where the game absolutely shits the bed. I can only assume that most people think of the early game when remembering DS1 fondly, which would make sense considering many playthroughs will be abandoned throughout all of Souls games at various points for various reasons, but especially within DS1. A game with many mechanics that punish the player, both intended and unintended. For example, lighting a bonfire without sitting at it, then dying and respawning a long distance away, getting stuck in an area like the sewers with no idea how to get out without googling it, or losing such a large amount of souls or humanity that it feels like you're better off starting over. Whatever the reason, it's safe to assume that a considerable amount of playthroughs will never make it past the Lord Vessel. Being the endgame will generally be the foggiest in players' memories and therefore get the most charity from DS1 fans. So allow me to refresh your memories by detailing the absolute dogshit endgame of Dark Souls, starting with the obvious first choice. A boss I almost put in the category of the ones everyone knows are bad, but only barely won me over to put her into the important fights category purely because she's a Lord fight. The Bed of Chaos. I refuse to elaborate. Hit me in the comments if you can think of a single reason why this fight is anything more than a cruel joke which comes at the cost of countless hours of players suffering through the incredibly frustrating gameplay and exceptionally long runbacks. Fuck this fight, and while we're at it, fuck Hollow Crow from Lords of the Fallen too. After collecting a Sunlight Maggot, you'll head to Nito, one of the worst gank fights in the game. The unkillable skeleton ads are incredibly annoying, both creating a frantic, frenzied boss fight when engaged with, while also revealing how pathetic Nito is when his skeletons are successfully avoided. You can do this by either using a divine weapon to prevent the ads from resurrecting, or using the fog and slumbering dragon rings to subvert them through stealth. After removing the gank from the equation, Nito is beyond a pushover. His Gravelord's Scream Slam can be completely avoided through exploiting its poor design. When blocking with a weapon, the hitbox of the blade fails to connect with you for some reason. Other than that, he has a completely uninteresting, unengaging Miasma AoE attack which gives ample time for the player to flee, as well as several sloppy melee attacks which will rarely even come close to you. This boss is once again unbearable for casuals or first-time players who don't understand how the fight works or don't know how to exploit it, all while offering a miserable runback and fall damage entering the arena. However, the fight becomes a snooze fest for anyone in the know. So who is this fight for? Either infuriating or boring with little room in between. I arbitrarily picked Seath next, who gets a free kill on you while invincible to build him up as a strong adversary before absolutely getting his shit kicked in after you break his special crack rock. This fight has awkward telegraphs, as almost all of his attacks will be AoEs you'll have to account for before the attack starts by recognizing seemingly unrelated movements Seath makes before each attack, which most certainly does not work fluidly while attempting to attack him while manipulating your camera. More often than not, most of his body will be off-frame, making this fight unreasonably janky, yet also very simple and easy. The only thing that makes him more complex is an equally awkward tail cut, as he is one of the worst examples of a boss always attempting to face you. His tail defense move is a series of slams with his 3 tentacles, which lift quickly and slam almost immediately with a wide range of effect. Overall, an unengaging, awkward fight with a really ugly way of instantly despawning his crystal attack's lingering effects. Not a lot to like about Seath. The last of the Lord Soul fights is the Four Kings, but first you'll have to beat Sif, or have already beaten Sif in the early game. I like Sif. Pretty good fight. Who's a good fight? The thing I would fine-tune about Sif is his jump away animation, which deals damage when near you at the beginning or when landing on you. Other than that, I think most people would agree that his moveset is pretty engaging and challenging, with well-telegraphed quick moves and interesting options for positioning. He can get a little springy at times, but he's definitely a highlight. After obtaining his ring, you can enter the Abyss. Hopefully you haven't attempted this early or entered the Abyss with the ring before attempting to switch to a better one only to be swallowed. Not to mention that you might have a dependence on your rings to make your build work, to avoid fat rolling or meet a skill requirement, or Bloodbite ring when using Life Hunt Scythe. See, I haven't even gotten to the boss itself and the experience is already abrasive. And I'm just gonna say it. The Four Kings hitboxes are fucking garbage. There's a weird distinction between being hit by the king's weapon and their hilt, or maybe their body themselves, which deal less damage but manages to hit you in some of the most ridiculous instances. This issue is compounded when attempting to make use of the pointless lock-on system, which will do anything in its power to pull you directly into the king's secondary hitbox at all costs. This fight also suffers from the same balancing issues as many others, with high damage builds able to kill 4 kings in 3 kings while never having to deal with more than one at a time, while low damage casuals will end up fighting 5 or even 6 of the 4 kings, with almost the whole fight ending up as gank with multiple tracking magic projectiles thrown in the mix. This can often lead to an overwhelming and frustrating experience for the people most vulnerable to the frustrations of the game. The people most experienced will barely have to play the fight at all, spending a majority of the fight waiting and walking only to dodge a handful of attacks. Fights like this are some of the worst for crushing the RPG experience, forcing you to a single choice for a ring slot and then overwhelming every build that doesn't strictly focus on damage. Pretty bad fight. Who's a bad fight? Now that you've collected all the Lord Souls, you'll be faced with the final boss, and hopefully you've done everything you wanted to do before beating him, because his death will force you into New Game Plus. This can be quite the annoyance when playing the game co-op, as either you or your co-op partner will be forced to solo Gwyn. This wouldn't be the worst problem if you had another character near Gwyn to help your friend through. However, DS1 won't allow you to summon cooperators who are more or less than 5 levels below or above you. Let's just face it, the co-op in DS1 is dog shit. The whole experience is tedious, as you'll have to play each shitty boss twice, all while spending your souls on levels at the same rate as your cooperator, and hopefully never dying with a large amount of souls, therefore forcing your cooperator to nerf themselves in levels to maintain the co-op run. Generally, the trade-off when playing solo is that you'll have to do everything yourself. However, the boss will focus direct, intentful moves in your direction, giving you a more controllable fight which favors skillful gameplay. But in DS1, the vast majority of bosses will attack with such sloppy moves and indirect forms of damage that it often feels like you're co-oping even when you're not. It leaves DS1 in a janky position where co-oping is highly beneficial for splitting aggro and helping casuals through difficult areas, while the co-op system barely manages to function, culminating in Gwyn forcing you to leave your co-op partner behind with a fight that's nearly impossible without splitting aggro through co-op or parrying, the skill ceiling mechanic of DS1. And that's not to say that parrying is hard in DS1, it is by far the easiest conventional parry, obviously excluding the gun parries of Bloodborne and the deflections of Sekiro. The problem that Gwyn highlights in his boss fight is a problem that wasn't solved until the release of Elden Ring 11 years later. Throughout the whole Dark Souls series, there was an unspoken rule that if a boss is parryable, then it becomes the only way you'll ever fight them. You can effectively reduce an entire boss to a single move that you learn the timing for, avoiding all the rest, and the parry solos the boss for you. This rule is highlighted by Champion Gundyr in DS3, him being a very aggressive boss with a large moveset that can be destroyed by keeping your distance while parrying his long-range moveset. While the exception to this rule is highlighted by Sister Fried, who uses moves that land so fast that the parry becomes too high risk to even bother attempting. Parrying has always been an all-or-nothing mechanic, which began with the first parryable boss of the series, Gwyn, a boss with a moveset that is unmanageably aggressive yet is embarrassingly underwhelming when manipulating his easily parried moves. Nothing exemplifies this more than having Soul of Cinder use many of Gwyn's moves in its boss fight without them being parryable, therefore making you have to engage with his moveset, which left much more of an impression than two-shotting Gwyn with parries. It makes a lot of sense that Gwyn is remembered more for Plin Plin Plon than he is for his fight itself. So that's the important fights. And they're some of the worst fights in all of FromSoft's work. The endgame in DS1 is hot garbage, and I would hope that most Dark Souls fans would agree with me, excluding the most delusional ones. So let's quickly go over what's left before reaching the DLC. The fights that are undisputed trash. The three forms of Asylum Demon are all pretty poorly made. The first is positioned early game enough to be a challenge, yet includes a plunge attack gimmick, which takes off nearly half the demon's health. You'll likely only see a couple more moves before beating him, likely including this slam attack with a god-awful hitbox. DS1 is chopped full of similar attacks as this. Moves that imply an invisible source of damage, such as wind force or something. Yet in practice, these moves are just failed telegraphs and shitty hitboxes. You might be able to justify it in the Asylum Demon fights, being that his big fat ass probably farted on the way down, releasing a toxic blast right into your fucking face, but it's much less justifiable within the Titanite Demon's moveset, which has notoriously bad hitboxes. Once you notice this sloppy design, you'll likely begin to see instances like this popping up all throughout the game. I'll point out the ones I notice as we go, but make no mistake, I'll be calling them what they are. Shitty hitboxes, and failed telegraphs. There have been many instances of wind attacks working well, such as Amelia in Bloodborne's Praying Slam. The main reason these attacks become interesting and well designed is in visually telegraphing the source of the damage, meaning that with each attempt, you'll grow better and better at threading the needle between taking damage and leaving yourself more time to deal damage yourself. DS1 fails telegraphing these attacks at all, leaving no way to engage with these moves effectively and leaving room to debate whether it was an issue of hitbox design or visual design, but without a doubt, it is poor design. The three Asylum Demon fights also fail to properly deal with you when positioned behind them. Avoiding the attacks he throws at you in these instances range from having to walk to the side slightly to not having to do anything at all, which is strange when considering the other moves in Stray Demons and Fire Sage's moveset, which explode directly in front of the demon, guiding the player to naturally attempt to position themselves behind the boss, a situation they cannot punish in any meaningful way. Moving on, the Tauros demon has a plunge attack gimmick, shitty wind hitboxes, and is clinically depressed. Capra Demon goes without saying, but has some of the worst ads, the worst boss arena, which might give you a seizure while playing, and one of the most insulting boss runbacks of all time. Unbearable. Sleeping Dragon has terribly untelegraphed hitboxes on his legs, which deal damage whenever he moves. His tail cut is obnoxiously designed for all the reasons I've previously mentioned. Also, he's generally understood to be pretty simple and easy. Ceaseless Discharge is static and boring with only a few moves in his moveset, which make it worth using the freebie way of beating him every single time to avoid wasting your time. Priscilla uses a invisibility gimmick, but is otherwise a pushover. Gwendolyn has like 3 moves, one of which is arrows, so if you were expecting an all-magic moveset and didn't see the tiny arrows, then enjoy the runback. Also, if you thought the sides of the arena were safe, his Soul Spear gets to no clip, so enjoy the runback. Which, I should mention, sets you back to the first Anor Londo bonfire, which isn't lit because you betrayed Anor Londo and lost that Firekeeper, which means you'll have to redo the Painting Guardian rafters to get back to the boss. Other than that, he has some pretty nice fan art. The Centipede Demon has shitty wind hitboxes on his arm slam and jumps so high above the camera that his jump attacks are untelegraphed. Definitely one of the cooler looking demons, but the fight itself is lackluster. And then there's Pinwheel, a fight that is universally known to be ridiculously easy. Nobody has ever died to this boss. And that's it, by the way. I honestly think I might have forgotten a fight based on how simple this list is, but so many of these fights throughout DS1's main game are just that, simple, and therefore easy to break down. It's kind of wild that of all of the base game DS1 fights, there's maybe like 3 fights that I would consider good without adding some generous modifier, such as good if you have high damage or good once you get rid of ads, something along those lines. I would say I consider Quelaag, Sif, and Ornstein Smo as good fights, while everything else ranges from mid to unbearably bad. Now before I get too negative, let's take a look at the last remaining fights. The first of the DLC fights is one of the most surprisingly forgettable bosses. It's another Magic the Gathering card shoved blatantly into the game, and I think that's why I tend to forget it exists. The Sanctuary Guardian is just a random manticore. I'm not sure why it's protecting the Sanctuary from us, some random hollow, rather than either fighting the darkness that's destroying Ulasil from within, or if it's on the side of the darkness, why it's not fighting Artorias, the guy tasked with destroying the darkness, but whatever. It fights us. This fight is serviceable, but I'm not the biggest fan of it. I feel like there are too many projectiles, and its melee moveset is pretty basic. However, I can definitely appreciate that this boss uses a wind move with a visual telegraph. Next is Artorias, a boss that did not live up to my expectations upon refighting him for this analysis. Artorias is definitely a cool boss, and the inspiration from Berserk goes a long way in making him memorable, but his moveset is lacking. He fails in many ways due to the slow, archaic combat systems of DS1. When using a larger weapon, I was only able to damage Artorias safely within a few openings, which were after his dash, thrust, or delayed swipe, which both activate more often when you make distance from him. This left me favoring disengagement from him, especially when considering his quick flip move that has terrible hitbox lingering, which can grab you into the slam after your iframes have ended, even when all of the movement of the move has already ended. He then proceeds to hit you 2 more times before you get the chance to get back up, and even if you dodge the move, you better not think that it's an opening or he'll punish you with his quick spin move. Best bet is to backroll almost every move, which to me is entirely disappointing. Artorias feels like a boss that should have been made in DS3. With some fine-tuning, his moveset could be made incredibly engaging. However, with the systems at hand in DS1, you often have to roll with the punches, fighting him in a much more boring way than he looks like he should be fought. Manus, however, was the opposite upon revisiting him. His larger sweeping arm attacks play very well against the slow, deliberate dodge rolls of DS1, and that's without the shitty wind hitboxes that you would come to expect at this point from the game. Not to mention that his spells come off as very engaging to deal with. One forces you to quickly dodge to the side, one will have you sprinting towards Manus before the Ring of Darkness can reach you, and one rains down darkness which follows you, similar to Elden Beast's star projectiles. Each is easily avoided under the right circumstances, and you'll almost always feel responsible for taking the hit should the attack land. All of this is while locked on, as apparently the system works perfectly fine when fighting an enemy specifically this size, maybe? I'm not sure why it works, but it does. Manus is hands down the best boss in DS1, and nothing else even comes close. Lastly, we have Kalameet. Setting up this boss fight sucks, as you'll need to go out of your way to find a key inside of a mimic, then enter his arena to spawn him, then go through a bunch of dialogue till the giant shoots him out of the sky. All of this is just to fight one of the worst dragon fights in Souls. Although I guess there's not a lot of competition, most dragon fights kinda suck now that I think about it. Midir is like the only good one. Anyway, Kalameet has a awkward tail cut, moves that will pull you along with them, taking you through the damage hitbox until you run out of iframes, and is pretty much just annoying to try and damage. So what did we learn from the DLC fights? Well, to me, I learned that even at the time, DS1 was outdated beyond what the contents within it was attempting to do. Artorias is simply a tease for the combat that would come with further titles. However, Manus proved that with a refined moveset, even the terrible combat of DS1 could be made enjoyable. It's just a crying shame that there's only one fight in all of DS1 at that level, which probably signaled to FromSoft that they needed to step their game up if they wanted to create something incredible. And to their credit, they absolutely achieved that. And now with the bosses and world building out of the way, we have to talk about the part of this analysis I was dreading. Now, one thing I've noticed in my few analysis style videos so far is that people often criticize me for overlooking the good things within the content I'm reviewing. Now, I would argue that is a form of light cope. If you make the claim that I just didn't appreciate the good aspects, then you can assume they exist without giving examples. I see this as a form of cognitive dissonance in the face of someone calling something you've previously enjoyed bad. The obvious conclusion that should eventually be reached is that you can appreciate, like, and even love something despite it being terrible. For example, I really enjoyed Starfield despite it being garbage at the moment. Also, I love watching slice of life animes, and they're fucking stupid for the most part. But I think the reason people claim that I don't give credit where they think it's due is because it's not worth mentioning the unremarkable parts of something or the good qualities that everyone knows are high quality. For example, I often said that Bloodborne looks incredible and has a very unique aesthetic within Souls games, and yet people still criticize me for not going into detail, contrasted against my harsh criticism of the lesser aspects of Bloodborne. This is more or less an issue of time constraints. My videos would be 30 hours long if I covered every single detail, and I would release one a year. I try my best to focus on my opinions that conflict with the ideological meta surrounding the property I'm analyzing, so as to offer more thought-provoking content. In doing so, I trim the fat of saying pointless information that everyone agrees on. You might think that I hate Artorias after listening to what I had to say about him, detailing his poorly designed moveset which encourages you to keep distance rather than engage, but this is not the case. For one thing, I find Artorias to be one of the cooler characters, and also most of his other moves have good hitboxes. The thing is, I just find him to be very mid, and that goes for just about every boss in this game. Nothing all that insulting, except Beta Chaos and Capra, but nothing all that great. If there's something that you think I missed so far, it's safe to assume that I didn't mention it because I didn't find it all that important to mention. I likely agree with you, but it doesn't affect how I feel about the game so far, which is very mid. However, that ends now. I just do not understand at all how this game got a reputation for having good level design. More specifically in reference to the buzzwords interconnected world that developed in the wake of DS1's success. It's easy to see how Demon's Souls failing to have a coherent world at all would result in Dark Souls developing the way that it did. Coming off of a very linear game with archstones that warp you to various locations, it's understandable that From would want to create a very tangible, immersive world which one could walk through. Community appreciation for their efforts have manifested in the idea of the interconnected world, which copycat devs would attempt to capture the magic of for years to come, almost always ending in failure. I think it's important to define what people mean when they say the term interconnected world, or ICW for short, considering I'm going to be saying it a lot. Now, I would certainly concede that my definition for an ICW might not be entirely accurate, but to me, I consider it to be representative of the following. An interconnected world is a world with level design that is neither open world nor linear. The various areas within must connect from a starting area, end into the next area, as well as offering additional pathways for various purposes, including giving a shortcut back to the previous area or an alternate path to a new area. Ideally, these alternate pathways would also be rewarding to find, offering players beneficial new pathways to take in order to give substantive gameplay when exploring the world. Also ideally, these pathways should be immersive to the experience, giving logical reasons why the pathway was previously blocked off. Now personally, I think the term itself, interconnected world, is highly misleading. If we're to assume that any game which has some part of its level design interconnected counts as an ICW, then every fucking video game world ever created is an interconnected world. If we're being analytical about it, then we can reduce it to a percentage of the world that is interconnected, but even then Dark Souls 1 is maybe 20% interconnected, with the remainder being linear paths. The flagship game that is the poster child for the concept is around 20%. Allow me to justify that claim. The Undead Asylum is a linear path. Your only path is either in or out of it, and this transition takes place with a cartoonish bird taxiing you back and forth for some reason. Firelink Shrine, Undead Parish, The Depths, and Darkroot Garden are all interconnected, but that's it for the rest of the game. Blighttown is linear and a pain in the ass, which thankfully can be subverted through the connections through Darkroot Garden. The Demon Ruins are linear, which require visiting in the early game, backtracking, and then returning to later. Upon a first playthrough, you might continue exploring past Quelaag, beat Ceaseless, and fight your way to the Wall of Light locking you out of the endgame content. I personally can attest to the fact that I found every single one of these walls before reaching Anor Londo on my first playthrough, which left me with a fuckload of backtracking. On your second time returning, you'll continue on the linear path through Lost Izalith, eventually reaching a very linear dead end upon beating the Bed of Chaos. Now, I've heard complaints before about DS2 having level design that was too linear, with complaints pointing out that the Primal Bonfires highlighted this, offering a one-way trip back to Majula as a way of saying, your linear path is over here, go find another path elsewhere. Make no mistake, DS1 absolutely does the exact same thing in every Lord fight, without the benefit of telling you your path is over and without the free trip back to the hub area. Both DS1 and DS2 have incredibly linear world design at times. However, due to DS1's awkward way of handling warp, it offers a much more abrasive experience to the player. often requiring Googling on a first playthrough. So after Izalith, say you explore the catacombs. Well, you have a linear path to the Tomb of the Giants, either the real way or through the Gravelord's Servant Covenant path. Kinda weird you can't just kill Nito early here, especially considering his skeleton ads aren't here, but whatever. Tomb of the Giants, also linear, leading to a dead end at Nito. Let's speed things up. Duke's Archive is convoluted, but ultimately your goal is linear, leading you to a dead end with Seath. New Londo is debatably linear, leading you to a dead end at the Abyss. You can argue that there's a shortcut from Darkroot once the water is drained, but this is only once your first linear objective in New Londo is completed. After that, I would argue your goal is recontextualized and your path becomes whatever linear path you want to take to fall into the dead end at the Abyss, but count it if you wish. Probably the worst instance of this takes place the second you leave the Undead Parish through Sen's Fortress, a linear path which, once completed, will have you so deep in the game it's unlikely you would ever turn back rather than continue towards the Lord Vessel and warp. Therefore, you head through the linear path through Anor Londo, reaching a dead end with a branching path that leads through the Painted World, the entrance to which is magic and becomes both your way in and out after completing the linear path through. Now, halfway through writing that section, I became very annoyed by reading the word linear so much. I almost began rewriting that section with better vocabulary in mind, but decided to keep it the way it was and continue writing this way. This was to drive the point home just how many instances of level design can be described as having a direct pathway through. Now, I should absolutely mention that I have no problem with the majority of these areas, at least not directly because they're linear. This section was purely in aid of discrediting the notion that DS1 has an interconnected world. If DS does, then the term itself is completely meaningless. I offer instead the term interconnected areas as a more direct way of discussing content. That way you can't hide behind the game as a whole when saying something along the lines of, Elden Ring has bad design because it's open world compared to Dark Souls, which has great design because it's an interconnected world. It's a ridiculous claim, and if you have a better argument to defend Dark Souls 1, I would love to hear it. However, if we take this idea even remotely seriously, we can reduce Elden Ring to a microcosm of its less open world design in the form of a single legacy dungeon. Then we can compare it to the entirety of Dark Souls 1 and see how it holds up. An easy metric-based way of comparing the two is by comparing the scale of each by looking up the walkthroughs for 100% completion of all items in Stormveil to find that the walkthrough takes an hour and 28 minutes to complete. With some simple math, we can see that DS1's walkthroughs by the same creator, Vextralife, within an equivalent amount of time, covers the Undead Asylum, Firelink Shrine, Upper Undead Burg, Undead Parish, Lower Undead Burg, the Depths, Blighttown, Northern Undead Asylum, and Darkroot Garden and Basin, all coming in at an hour and 34 minutes and 55 seconds. Almost the entirety of all of the interconnected areas in DS1 take up the same amount of time as a single, cohesive, well-designed legacy dungeon in Elden Ring. Yet I guarantee you that OG DS1 fans will try to find a way to underplay the interconnectivity of Elden Ring's design in order to overvalue it in DS1. So following that line of thought, let's analyze the interconnected areas of Dark Souls 1. Firelink Shrine and Undead Parish are both done very well. Firelink acting as an inner-world nexus which connects many of the other starting point areas works well in encouraging the player to explore. However, I would add that many of these areas are utterly useless to you until you reach the Lord Vessel, which hampers the explorative factor of the game. But I would largely attribute that to the warp system, which I will address shortly. Undead Parish is wildly effective as an interconnected area compared to the rest of the game. You have connections to Firelink, the Depths, Sen's Fortress, Darkroot both at Havel and by Andre, and the iconic double elevator leading back to Firelink at a very pivotal point in the game. Unlocking this shortcut gives you a straight shot from Firelink to Sen's, then Anor Londo after beating Quelaag, and offers a convenient blacksmith, all of which does not go unappreciated. It is, however, unfortunate that this elevator is unlocked simply by walking on it. It would have been nice to have a more immersive reason why it was disabled in the first place than re-enabled at the press of a button, but this is more of a neutral observation than a direct criticism. All of this early game interconnectivity is done quite elegantly, with thoughtful design and rewarding mechanics. However, this is the point at which FromSoft clearly gassed out. While the late game areas are distinctly linear, the last remaining area of interconnectivity is indefensibly poorly put together. I call this area Stupid Fucking Green Path Alley. It's clear to me that FromSoft had designed themselves into a corner. Their focus on creating a tangible world to walk through had left them with the nearly impossible task of piecing together pathways between all the various segmented areas they had designed so far. Their answer to this problem? An ugly-ass valley cutting through the game which could be traversed by artificial, immersion-breaking pathways jutting out of the sides. This valley connects the side of Darkroot Garden and the Valley of the Drakes through an elevator, but both the top and the bottom of the valley are awkwardly used to connect the previously designed areas of the game. I can't help but to assume that designing this area left a huge portion of space within it bare of content, which resulted in the lazily designed Valley of the Drakes, an area with 1 undead dragon, 6 drakes, and no visual design reflecting drakes actually living there. You compare this to DS2's Dragon Shrine area, you'll see eggs, nests, and dragons flying through the sky. DS1's Valley of the Drakes is downright embarrassing in comparison. Embarrassing compared to Dark Souls 2. Please allow that to sink in. Now this valley highlights something uniquely broken about DS1. In terms of traversing its world, you'll have one of two silly situations play out. The first being that you'll often have to cover a large distance to reach your objective, with very little engaging gameplay within. More often than not, you're running past most enemies, hoping not to be caught off guard and killed, only to get sent back a large distance once more. However, because of the interconnected nature of the world design, you'll spend a lot of time sprinting around pathways heading the direction you previously came from so that the world can meet up with itself at the various connection points. The second silly situation you'll come across is the realization that this world is ridiculously small. Almost every single Lord Soul is directly below Firelink Shrine, within walking distance from one another, and that's while walking convoluted spiraling pathways. Massively powerful enemy factions that make up the entirety of the world building of this game, and they've all ended up as direct neighbors of one another. And so the world design is stuck between the rock and a hard place of being completely dull by having you walk large distances to make the world feel bigger, and breaking your immersion entirely when you realize that the world is utterly nonsensical and bizarrely compact. This all becomes somewhat insulting when walking through the Valley of the Drakes, an area that only exists as a connection point in the world, is absolutely ugly to look at, and features extended periods of sprinting down random uninspired pathways that do nothing to blend themselves into the environment. The people who call DS1's interconnected world immersive have to be so selective with their memories, because design like this is diametrically opposed to the ideas they want to have about this game. Along that same line of thought, let's look at the next idea within DS1 meant to facilitate a sense of immersion: the restrictive warp system, or lack thereof in early game. It seems to me that people tend to place a great deal of importance on the lack of warp in the early game to emphasize the level design and increase the value of shortcuts, as well as to reward your knowledge of the world itself. The most extreme form of this mindset is to say that the game falls apart after obtaining the Lord Vessel and the ability to warp. And while I disagree with the framing of this idea, I also don't want to underplay what the sentiment is really saying. I think what people mean to say is that FromSoft felt less of an obligation to create interconnected areas when given the freedom to design linear paths that can be warped back from to save time. I think this is a pretty optimistic, borderline naive outlook on the situation. It's clear that FromSoft suffered from development constraints when creating the endgame, specifically within the god-awful Lost Izalith. Regardless of warp or not, those constraints would have still shown their effects on the final game, so pretending that warp is some negative thing when it's one of the only things barely managing to hold DS1's endgame together is pretty silly. So the real question becomes, would the early game be made better if warp were enabled from the start, and if so, then would it be made even better to allow warp to every bonfire? In my personal opinion, I absolutely think it would. The basis for my opinion is that Dark Souls 1 will waste an extraordinary amount of your time traversing pointless areas with an insane amount of backtracking. For example, even on the absolute most efficient run you could possibly have, in which you sit at the Undead Parish bonfire, then travel all the way to Quelaag, beat her in one try, then ring the bell, and use a homeward bone to return to the parish, you're still faced with the fact that you'll have to return to the Demon Ruins a second time after obtaining the Lord Vessel. If activating the warpable bonfire within the Demon Ruins was possible, you might be able to save yourself a single trip. However, this bonfire is already lit by the Firekeeper, meaning you'll have no way of activating it for warp without sitting at it, therefore overriding your homeward bone back. Even when putting yourself in the most stressful situations in the name of efficiency, you can't prevent Dark Souls from wasting your time. This also applies if you were to explore the undead crypts early and attempt to set up a warp point by lighting the bonfire, then boning out. Lighting a bonfire is completely meaningless in this game. It doesn't add the fire to your warpable bonfires, it doesn't give you a checkpoint to respawn at, it quite literally does nothing. The restrictive nature of how bonfires work offers a very boring static playthrough that you'll have to complete every time through the early game, while offering nothing interesting to manipulate that. Your best bet is to use every single bonfire you possibly can as a checkpoint, because there is virtually nothing you can do within the bonfire system to change how far you'll have to walk through this world. So you might as well give yourself the safety net of a close respawn, because regardless of your success or failure, you'll still have to do a run back either to or from Firelink, either before or after warp is enabled. I think the biggest misunderstanding when considering warp is to assume that the simple addition of a warp feature would ruin otherwise interesting level design by giving the player an option to subvert large sections of the level when attempting to efficiently move through the world. The ironic thing is that I just described the exact situation that plays out when using the double elevator in the Undead Parish. By reaching this point in the game, either by beating the Undead Burg, or by taking the green path through the Valley of Drakes with the Master Key, unlock the ability to subvert ever having to go through the Undead Burg again by virtue of the shortcut. This is the exact same situation as lighting a warpable bonfire. Now, please listen to this carefully, because it's going to sound for a moment like I'm undercutting my point, but I'll bring it home eventually. I think this single instance of an interesting in-world tangible shortcut works better than a bonfire. It is absolutely immersive and efficient, acting as a reward for reaching that point in the game. It might serve the same purpose as a warpable bonfire, but it also adds an interesting level of depth to the connections of the world, making it feel a bit more alive. However, and this is a huge however, this is the single instance that this mechanic is used in an appropriate, efficient, and convenient way. The rest of the early game leaves you completely out to dry in terms of having warpless bonfires and nothing interesting to supplement the inconvenience of traveling this world. It's just ugly long green pathways and then long stretches of linear world design with bonfires that only serve to be checkpoints along the way. The question of warp or no warp is ultimately meaningless. Good level design will ultimately shine through no matter which system is used, and bad level design will leave an ugly, boring taste in your mouth, no matter if it connects areas together or not. I think the best option is to default to warp as a matter of convenience in the interest of preventing your players from wasting large amounts of time pointlessly, which by the nature of the history of their games, I think FromSoft would agree with me on. Despite all of that, if you still think that warping would break the immersion of the game in any significant way, well, I sure hope you have never used a homeward bone before, right? You know, the item born of convenience, offered to you after most bosses, which gives you a free warp back from any location. Because in-game, the bones are the same thing burning in the bonfires that allow you to warp. And that's not to mention all of the ridiculous contrived ways you end up warping around the game through other means. Crows, bat demons, Nito's casket, dying to Seath only to respawn in prison for some reason. And just to be clear, I'm fine with all those things, just like I'm fine with warping. Anything that makes the world feel slightly bigger that also avoids wasting my time is greatly appreciated. As an honorable mention, I wasn't sure where to work this note into the script so far, so here will do. Even when using the warp feature post-Lord Vessel, the lack of all bonfires being warpable leads to some very tedious, annoying situations, the worst of which might be reaching the DLC. The first step of which is to kill the Puddle Hydra in Deeproot to spawn Dusk, and the second being to kill a crystal golem within the Duke's Archives. Why is this quest hinging on killing one of the most annoying creatures in the game that you would only think of killing if you were running a dragon weapon and wanted the upgrades for? I do not know. But through my ignorance to this step, I had already cleared through Seath before starting the DLC. This meant that I had to start from Andre, the closest warpable bonfire, travel to the Hydra, kill it without falling into the abyss within the puddle, bone out to reset the world, walk back to the puddle to free Dusk from the crystal golem, bone out, warp to Anor Londo, walk all the way to the lift, take the lift, kill the golem, then take the pendant, bone out, warp to Andre, and walk back to the puddle. A process that I probably fucked up a step or two and had to redo several points through. This gameplay is fucking obnoxious, and even with the required guide to understand what the fuck you're supposed to do, it still takes quite a while. A lot of this is due to the poorly designed Deeproot area, but also suffers from having no close warpable bonfire to either objective area.
Quick note from the editor, but this fucking dumbass forgot about Ash Lake and the Moonlight Butterfly. So, yeah.
So I forgot Moonlight and I forgot Ash Lake, but Moonlight is pretty bad, pretty boring. I think most people would agree, and pretty forgettable, obviously. And for Ash Lake, it's pretty much just an optional linear area for the sake of the Covenant of the Dragons, but yeah, pretty easy to forget. There's a lot I wish to say about the balance of DS1's items, bosses, and overall meta, but I think it's important to address one thing that seems to be slowly fading in people's minds. DS1 seems to be remembered quite fondly within the Souls community. When asked to reminisce about the history of Souls games, people generally look back at DS1 with rose-tinted glasses, remembering all the lessons learned along the way, the things that confronting a difficult game could reveal about ourselves, allowing us the option to take control and face our weaknesses head-on. It makes sense that the community would look back and see the most personal experiences they had with the game, and appreciate the growth they've seen since first playing. A recurring sentiment throughout Souls is the idea that these games have saved people, and I think that makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of important coping skills that can be learned through pushing your limits within a difficult situation, and the Souls games can act as a catalyst for players to take their first steps in confronting something that seems impossible at a first glance, only to persevere after learning bit by bit about their enemy, their situation, and their own limits and abilities, until the situation no longer seems impossible, but downright easy. These are the results when the term "get good" is used encouragingly. When taken as a lesson, get good is a simple, effective, non-patronizing way of telling someone, or telling yourself, that a bad attitude won't change the challenge you're facing. When used in good faith as a command, get good shows that you believe in someone, that they're capable of beating their adversity through virtues of patience, perseverance, knowledge, and growth. Unfortunately, this is only one side of the coin. Get good can be used as a tool, or, on its much uglier side, a weapon. The thing that most people are likely to forget about DS1 in favor of blind nostalgia is that DS1 is one of the most toxic games of all time. Don't believe me? Just take one look at the hugely popular Level 4 Dark Bead build, which was purely meant to one-shot new players. My first DS1 PvP invader was a bead build, and I had no fucking idea what had just hit me. Besides the specific instances of griefing, the more toxic side of the fanbase have been known to be massive gatekeepers, coining the term filthy casual, using get good to put people down and build up their own egos, and saying that all modern FromSoft games are too easy. Well, if that's the case, and these behaviors are even close to the remotely justified actions of truly elite gamers, then clearly Dark Souls must be a very difficult game to be good at, right? No, absolutely not. Dark Souls is a game that is very difficult to be bad at and unbelievably easy to be good at. This is because of several poorly balanced aspects in favors of hand-holding the so-called good players and absolutely punishing the fuck out of casuals. I've left breadcrumbs throughout this whole analysis pointing out these design choices, but now it's time to address it head-on. The Red Tearstone Ring is an absolute joke in DS1. A 50% increase in damage is undeniably ridiculous, making the game a complete cakewalk in which you can kill several bosses in a handful of hits, without fully upgrading your weapon, and you'll almost never have to deal with gank. The RTSR is the epitome of an increase in damage, but damage increases across the board are infinitely more useful than health or armor could ever be in the meta of DS1. The other overpowered instance of training wheels that so-called good players will utilize is the Dark Wood Grain Ring, which increases your iframes and distance traveled when rolling. Kinda funny that Bloodhound's Step in Elden Ring is universally and rightfully known as the lower skill option, yet when DS1 has the exact same mechanic, it's locked behind low carry weight, which only non-casuals would have the option to use. And so the players who should need the help least end up with builds that deal fuckloads of damage and dodge rolls with massive passive advantages in avoiding enemy attacks altogether. Meanwhile, the health build casual with no points into damage stats, a mostly unleveled weapon, and fat-ass armor giving them a medium roll at best, are bound to spend more time in boss fights, dodge more attacks, only to eventually end up taking damage, which means they have no choice but to use the most underpowered mechanic in Dark Souls, the Estus Flask. The Estus is uniquely terrible in DS1, with an animation time that rivals an attack from even the largest strength weapon. You'll be forced to time your healing around the largest openings you can possibly find. On a lot of bosses, you might not even notice that the flask sucks so hard, being that several bosses will spaz out at random times, such as Sif or Quelaag jumping away randomly, or they'll simply forget to attack you for extended amounts of time, giving you the spare time to heal. But with bosses like Artorias, who have very aggressive behavior, you will almost never find the time to heal. The same thing applies to gank fights, which damage-lacking casuals will spend a disproportionate amount of time in. When the game is built in a way that using the Estus opens you up to massive risk of being hit once more, therefore requiring you to heal again, you're likely going to end up on the losing side of a war of attrition. Whereas the RTSR user will never have to worry about using the painfully slow Estus. Will get an insane damage buff, get better, more forgiving dodge rolls, and will get to pretend they're better than you for it. All because they memorized the 5 moves these simplistic, archaic bosses can do, and dodged the 3 moves they saw before the boss was destroyed. The debate over Souls games potentially someday having a difficulty setting was always pretty much dead on arrival. The world of these games needed to stay consistent to maintain a balance of difficulty, and most people would agree that part of the experience is to force yourself to push through challenges that are above your current level, or to return to the world in search of items that might increase your power. Elden Ring solved this issue of difficulty in some incredibly tasteful and inventive ways. The aforementioned Bloodhound Step offers players with even a heavy load the ability to utilize the most powerful evasive ability in the game through the Ash of War system. The Spirit Summons offered a unique and interesting mechanic as well as an economy of upgrade materials to collect and spend on a potentially powerful ally within boss fights, ultimately culminating in the Mimic tier, which would double the effectiveness of your build. For the first time, the more casual player base had something that higher skill players would be jealous of. In my experience, I found the game would be just a step below my skill level, while adding a degree of chaos I would rather avoid when using Spirit Summons. So I've only ever summoned like 3 times. Despite that, I find the Spirit Summon system to be incredibly cool, and I am so glad that it exists within the game for the players who need it or who just want to use them. I'm excited to see what additions to the Spirit Summon system will come out with Shadow of the Erdtree. Still coming out, right? Miyazaki, please! We're starving out here! Anyway, the difficulty system that FromSoft had developed in Elden Ring let players choose how easy or hard they wished to play by nature of their kits, rather than changing the difficulty of the world as a whole. This gave some uniquely beneficial comforts to the player base who needed it most, granting a fluid level of challenge adjustable at a whim. This is thoughtful, inventive, inclusive, and intelligent design, juxtaposed against Dark Souls 1. The game that absolutely coddles its advanced players while shitting all over casuals. If you'll allow me to speculate for a moment, I think this false level of skill left the most toxic part of the fanbase with overinflated egos, drunk on the power of being able to put others down and build themselves up. But when other Souls games released with faster-paced combat, more intricate bosses with larger movesets, and tighter balancing on weapons and buff, with the red tearstone being reduced to a respectable 20% increase of damage, the toxic players were left in a very boomer-like situation where they just couldn't stand out like they used to. When being good at DS3 turned out to be actually difficult, they just couldn't chop it with the more advanced players of a new generation. Just like how I used to be good at shooter games, then Fortnite released and the average 13-year-old can build twice as fast as I'll ever be able to do. I became a dumb old boomer grouch about Fortnite building for a while because it was new and I wasn't able to keep up, so my brain rationalized it as being dumb and bad. I believe a similar cognitive dissonance came over the OG toxic DS1 players too, resulting in the bitter sentiment that all modern FromSoft games are trash and DS1 was peak, with copium-based ideas popping up everywhere, like that DS1's slower combat was more tactical. I'm very sorry if this is something that you believe. I'm not trying to hurt your feelings or attack something you enjoy, but the combat in Dark Souls is garbage. The slow, restrictive nature results in the most boring cookie-cutter encounters. You dodge, you attack, you get stamina back, over and over and over. On the other hand, if you are one of those toxic pricks who spent like 5 years talking down to people only to be left in the past when better games came out, then I am trying to hurt your feelings. Fuck you, the combat sucks. A DS1 no-hit run will end with an encounter that involves parrying Gwyn twice with the easiest parry of all time, and the DS1 diehards will say that it's peak gameplay, and then see an Elden Ring no-hit run. Yup, they ruined it. Made it too easy. That's fucking ridiculous. So that's pretty much everything I have to say about the content in Dark Souls 1. So what's my final analysis? It's kind of a piece of shit. The lore is piecemeal, nonsensical, and hard to follow. The game is ugly, looking graphically outdated at the time of its release. Bosses are functional, but simplistic at best almost across the board. Level design is wasteful of the player's time, even when traversed as efficiently as possible. And the balance is utterly broken, resulting in resounding toxicity throughout the fanbase. And the funny thing is, I believe at one point the fans realized that. I feel like at one point it was known that being delusional was par for the course for being a Souls fan. It took a very special kind of person to look at a game like this and think, yeah, this is what I want to spend my time doing. This is what I want to be best at. These early adopter weirdos would be the catalyst for this game's success, because this game has very little going for it in terms of the content within the game itself. It offers you hollow frustration through a paper-thin world made of generic fantasy elements, simple bosses, and half-baked mechanics. There's nothing within the game itself that offers a remotely enjoyable experience. So how does it happen that a hollow game like DS1 would spawn all of this? All of the incredible titles to follow, all of the personal stories of growth and triumph, all of the community appreciation for this so-called masterpiece. What's the missing piece? How did DS1 fool you into thinking you enjoyed it?
It's nothing!
Oh, it's okay. I didn't get it the first time either.
Well, the missing piece is you. The players. You're what made DS1 great. A community of people willing to throw themselves against a poorly designed game just to say that they could. Just to beat a challenge in front of them. A cult-like group of people worshipping the ideals of difficulty, suffering through the pain of practice, the bitterness of defeat, and ultimately reaching the pleasures of success. DS1 is most certainly not an enjoyable game to play, but it is a satisfying game to beat. An entirely internal source of pleasure derived from overcoming an obstacle. The culture that had developed around those final moments of success being worth all the effort and investment is the lifeblood of FromSoft's work. The idea grew until players began no-hitting the entire game just to give themselves an extra challenge. This being a game, I might add, that absolutely was not designed to be no-hit. Seath's first encounter speaks to that. However, the players did it anyway, putting in the hard work to subvert all the flaws within Dark Souls' design for one solid perfect run. And don't let me forget all the lore channels on YouTube, putting in titanic efforts to piece together all the scattered lore bits written across all the armor and weapons throughout the game. Their work to create fluid narratives, speculation, useless data, and hidden information which needed to be data mined to have ever seen the light of day, has given such immense value to the world of the Dark Souls series, which might never have been appreciated without their contributions. Keep in mind that Destiny's Grimoire cards were arguably the exact same system of delivering lore as DS1, but was universally disliked. The community of lore masters have kept Dark Souls from ever having to meet the same criticism. DS1's success was largely an accident. The game itself doesn't deserve to have reached such heights and to be praised so thoroughly. However, I am so glad that it did succeed. The happy accident that Dark Souls was is directly responsible for some of the greatest games ever created, spawning several new genres of games along the way. If it wasn't for the undeserved worship of Dark Souls, I would have never gotten to play DS3, the game that reignited my love for gaming, and I would have never seen Elden Ring, my favorite game of all time. So I need to offer a genuine show of appreciation to all the delusional, weirdo DS1 vets. Without you and your various mental illnesses, the gaming world would be very different from the one we have today, and FromSoft would have never gotten their chance to shine. Because that's the real important message I want to send with this video. I didn't make it just to shit all over a fan favorite game. I wanted to show just how much FromSoft has grown from their initial moment of success. They were given a shot in the spotlight, and through their hard work and dedication, they've managed to stun the whole gaming world with their abilities. And I don't think you can even remotely begin to appreciate that without understanding just how pathetically humble their origins were. In the words of young Sheldon's dad, "If you don't look back and think you were dumb, then you haven't learned anything." From has gone from barely managing to shit out this ugly mess to setting the industry standards that AAA studios fail to meet time and time again. From's success is deeply inspirational. And one of the reasons I called Lords of the Fallen an insult to FromSoft is because Lord's design reflects a grossly simplified idea of what makes FromSoft's games incredible. FromSoft wasn't great because they made a game that was just difficult. They're great because they never stopped improving, even after their games weren't just difficult, but also difficult to put down. That's the legacy of FromSoft. the legacy of the greatest developer of all time. Because Dark Souls might just have been a piece of shit. But do you know what else is in shit? Seeds. Seeds that have been digested just enough to break down their outer shells. Seeds that have been shat out within a moist, bacteria-rich fertilizer. The perfect conditions for a little seed to grow. But even in these conditions, a seed still needs sunlight. It can't grow in the dark. So remember next time you want a delightful little snack, that the sweetest fruit you might ever taste began as a seed, buried deep within a steaming pile of shit. I'd like to thank you all for watching, as well as everyone who watched my last video, especially those of you who offered criticism, constructive or otherwise. Thanks to you, my videos are now much easier to make now that I've seen that the consensus is that my facecam doesn't add anything to the video. For me, it was both a way to cover up my streaming facecam, as well as a way of showing that I wasn't going to hide behind anonymity when making controversial statements. However, if it's unnecessary, I will gladly take the convenience. If you feel as though my content is worth supporting, you can help my engagement by various YouTube-based means, or if you're feeling really generous, you can be the first supporter on my Patreon page. Lastly, I would just like to dedicate this video to my good friend iBootyJuice. Without him, I would have never played any of these incredible games. His friendship is invaluable to me. Here's to many more ridiculous co-op runs, my brother. If you happen to enjoy Destiny 2 content, I recommend to you his Twitch, as he often streams endgame D2 content or Crucible. I'll have links to everything in the description. Thank you all so much for watching.
You know, Homer, it's very easy to criticize.
Fun, too.